Picture this. It's 1918. The guns finally fall silent. The most brutal, destructive war in all of human history is over. You can just imagine the relief, right? I mean, this was a moment of incredible hope. It was a real chance to build a whole new world from the ashes of the old one. But as we now know, this wasn't the beginning of a lasting peace. It was just the start of a whole new kind of trouble. Okay, so let's get right into it. The entire planet was ready for a new chapter, one that was supposed to make a catastrophe like the Great War impossible. And yet, you fast forward just 2 short decades and the world is plunged right back into darkness. So what on earth went wrong? How did it all fall apart? That's the huge question we're going to dig into. So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at that initial promise of a new peace. Then, we'll dive into Woodrow Wilson's really grand, ambitious vision for it. After that, we'll see how that big vision just collided with let's call it the messy reality of the treaty negotiations at Versailles. Then the fight moves to America, which helps create a world in turmoil. And finally, we'll unpack the unsettled legacy of this whole fractured peace.
Okay, so to really get the hope of that moment, you first have to grasp the absolute chaos. The end of the war wasn't just a ceasefire, it was the total collapse of the old way of doing things. Think about it. The German, Russian, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires. These were giants that had ruled the world for centuries. And just, poof, they were gone. And into that massive power vacuum steps one man who thinks he has a plan. And this was a huge deal. For the first time ever, a sitting American president traveled overseas while in office. When Woodrow Wilson's ship docked in Europe, the crowds went wild. He wasn't just treated like a leader. People were hailing him as a savior. Millions genuinely believed this one man held the key to preventing a nightmare like this from ever happening again.
And Wilson, he really believed he had the answer. He came armed with a radical new blueprint for how nations should interact. It was called the 14 Points, and at its very heart was an idea he thought would make the world safe for democracy once and for all. So, the core of his whole plan came down to this one really powerful idea: collective security. Wilson wanted to create a League of Nations, basically a club where every country would guarantee each other's safety. It's an all-for-one, one-for-all deal. An attack on any member would be seen as an attack on everybody. This was a total game changer, a huge shift away from the secret deals and power games that led to the war in the first place.
And for Wilson, you gotta understand, this wasn't just clever politics. This was a moral crusade. This was the whole reason he said he'd brought America into the war. It was about forging a new world order based on shared values, not just who had the biggest army.
But you know how it goes. When Wilson's big, idealistic vision got to the negotiating table at the Paris Peace Conference in Versailles, well, it slammed right into the brick wall of cold, hard European power politics. His fellow leaders, they were not nearly as excited about his plans. And this quote from the French Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau, just says it all, doesn't it? He'd seen Germany invade his country twice in his lifetime. For him, this wasn't about some abstract 14-point plan. He wanted revenge, and he wanted ironclad security to make sure it never, ever happened again. And that divide was just huge. You had Wilson on one side pushing for his League of Nations, for self-determination, for a peace that would last. But on the other side, well, the Allies, especially Britain and France, they had a very different shopping list. They wanted to keep their empires, they wanted to make Germany pay crippling reparations, and they wanted Germany to admit the whole war was their fault. So after months of just brutal back and forth, they finally hammered out a compromise: the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson got his League of Nations, which was a huge win for him, but he had to pay a steep price. The treaty slapped Germany with incredibly harsh penalties, the very thing Wilson worried would plant the seeds for another war. He himself called it an imperfect peace, but he figured, hey, it was better than no peace at all. So you'd think winning the peace in Europe was the hard part. Turns out Wilson's biggest, most difficult fight wasn't in Versailles. It was waiting for him back home. After selling the League to the world, he now had to sell it to his own people. And his main opponent, his political nemesis, was this guy, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. And Lodge's argument was actually pretty simple, and to a lot of Americans, it made a lot of sense. He basically said, wait a minute, if we join this league, aren't we giving up our power to decide when and where America goes to war? Aren't we getting tangled up in everyone else's problems? Wilson, not one to back down, decides to go over the Senate's head and take his case straight to the American people. He starts this insane, grueling cross-country train tour to rally support. But the strain, the travel, it was just too much. In September of 1919, he collapsed from a massive stroke that left him almost completely incapacitated. With Wilson out of the picture, his opponents easily took control, and by March 1920, it was official. The Senate rejected the treaty. And America's no vote sent shockwaves across the planet. That imperfect peace Wilson had worried about, it began to crack and splinter almost immediately, unleashing all kinds of chaos, not just overseas, but right here in the United States too. The fallout was messy, to say the least, and you can really see it in these three major crises that popped up right after the war. First, the map of the Middle East gets completely redrawn by European powers, who basically just divvy it up for themselves. Back in the US, you've got this massive paranoia about communism, the Red Scare, and at the exact same time, deep-seated racial tensions just explode in what became known as the Red Summer, a horrific wave of violence in cities across the country. Remember Wilson's big idea of self-determination? Yeah, that got tossed right out the window in the Middle East. The old Ottoman Empire was carved up and handed over to Britain and France as mandates. Mandates was the nice, polite word for it. Let's call it what it was. Old-school 19th century imperialism with a new coat of paint. And it planted seeds of resentment that are still growing today. Meanwhile, back in the States, that summer of 1919 was one of the most violent periods in American history. But there was something different this time. Black soldiers who had just returned from fighting for democracy in Europe were not about to come home and silently accept racism. And the great W.E.B. Du Bois captured this new spirit perfectly with these powerful words. We return. We return from fighting. We return fighting. So, what are we left with? What's the real legacy of all this? That one vote in the U.S. Senate in 1920, it wasn't just a political squabble. It was a single choice that would end up echoing through the rest of the century. Think about this number for a second. 58. That's how many different countries from all over the world eventually signed up and joined the League of Nations. I mean, this was a massive global movement, a real sign that the world was desperate for a new way to solve problems without another war. But there was a giant, fatal flaw in this whole grand plan. The League was missing its most important member. It was like a ship without a rudder, because the one country that dreamed it up, the most powerful country in the world, wasn't there. And how many votes were there in the U.S. Senate to pass the treaty as it was written, no strings attached? This many. 0. Not a single one. The political opposition was just that absolute. And just like that, Wilson's grand dream for a new world order, an American dream, born and championed by an American president, it didn't die on some distant battlefield. It died quietly, right there on the floor of the U.S. Senate. Which leaves us with one last really big question to chew on. Without the United States as its anchor, the League was powerless to stop the rise of fascism and the aggression that led directly to World War II. So, was another world war inevitable? Or did America's choice to walk away, to turn its back on its own creation, doom the world to repeat its darkest chapter all over again?